Marcus Johnson stood in front of the police station, his hands trembling slightly as he checked his phone one more time. 3:45 p.m. He had been standing there for 15 minutes, gathering the courage to walk inside. The threatening messages on his phone glowed back at him, making his stomach turn. At 17, Marcus was known for his calm demeanor. As president of the debate club and a straight-A student at Lincoln High School, he usually handled pressure well. But this was different. For the past 2 weeks, someone had been following him and 2 other black students after school, taking photos of them and sending threatening messages from anonymous numbers. The glass doors of the police station felt heavier than they should as Marcus pulled them open. The cool air inside made him adjust his school blazer. The front desk officer looked up briefly, then went back to his computer screen. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I need to file a report." The officer pointed to a plastic chair without looking up. "Take a seat. Someone will be with you." Marcus sat down, his backpack between his feet. He watched as 3 other people came in after him and were helped immediately. One woman had lost her cat. Another man wanted to report a broken car window. Each time, Marcus straightened up, hoping it would be his turn. Each time, he was passed over. After 45 minutes, a heavy-set man in a police captain's uniform emerged from a side door. "You there?" he called out to Marcus. "Follow me." The nameplate on his desk read Captain Richard Sullivan. The office was small but neat, with awards and certificates covering one wall. Captain Sullivan didn't offer Marcus a seat, so he stood, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "What's your problem?" Sullivan asked, not looking up from his computer. Marcus pulled out his phone. "Sir, I need to report some threatening behavior. Someone's been following me and 2 other students from my school. They've been taking pictures of us and sending messages like these." He tried to show Sullivan the phone screen. Sullivan glanced at it for less than a second. "Kids these days think everything is threatening. What were you doing when these pictures were taken?" "Just walking home from school, sir. It's happened 6 times now. Always around the same spot near Wilson Street." "Wilson Street?" Sullivan's tone changed slightly. "That's a nice area. What were you doing there?" Marcus felt his face grow hot. "I go to Lincoln High School. I live in the Oak Hill subdivision." Sullivan leaned back in his chair, looking at Marcus properly for the first time. His expression shifted from dismissive to suspicious. "Oak Hill? How long has your family lived there?" "My whole life, sir." Marcus worked to keep his voice level. "My father." "Listen," Sullivan cut him off. "We get a lot of reports from teenagers who want attention. Kids who watch too many crime shows and think every little thing is a conspiracy. We don't have time for that here." "But sir, the messages." "Probably just some of your classmates playing pranks. Or maybe someone who noticed you where you shouldn't be. Are you sure you were just walking home?" Marcus felt the anger rising in his throat. "Yes, sir. I have screenshots of all the messages. I have dates and times. 2 other students." "File a complaint with your school if you're having problems with classmates." Sullivan stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "And stay in areas where you belong. That will solve most of your problems." Marcus stood there, phone still in his outstretched hand, evidence unexamined. His perfect attendance record at school would show a gap today. He had skipped his last class to come here, believing the police would help. Now he felt foolish. "Is there anything else?" Sullivan asked, already walking toward his office door. "No, sir," Marcus replied quietly. He put his phone away and walked out, past the front desk where new people were coming in, past the glass doors that now felt like barriers instead of protection. Outside, the afternoon sun was still bright. Marcus checked his phone again. One new message had arrived while he was inside. "Saw you going to the cops. Bad move, smart boy." His hands were shaking again, but this time with anger rather than fear. As he walked to the bus stop, Marcus thought about his father, about the conversations they'd had about being twice as good to be treated half as well. He thought about the donation checks he sometimes saw on his father's desk, the ones going to the local police foundation. Marcus didn't know it yet, but this afternoon would change everything, not just for him, but for Captain Sullivan, the entire police department, and the community they were supposed to serve. James Johnson sat in his corner office on the 20th floor, looking over the city skyline. His desk was covered with papers, but one document stood out, a check for $500,000 made out to the City Police Foundation. It was the same amount he had donated every year for the past decade, always anonymously through his family's foundation. He picked up his pen to sign it, then paused as his secretary buzzed through the intercom. "Mr. Johnson, the police department's quarterly report just arrived, and your son Marcus called. He said he'd be late for dinner." "Did he say why?" James asked, his forehead wrinkling with concern. Marcus was never late without a good reason. "No, sir, he just said not to worry." James put down his pen and opened the police department's report. As the city's biggest anonymous donor, he received detailed updates about how his money was spent. New patrol cars, better training equipment, community outreach programs, all things that were supposed to make the police force better, more connected to the people they served. Across town, Captain Richard Sullivan was having a very different kind of afternoon. He sat in the monthly staff meeting, listening to Chief Roberts talk about budget needs. "We need to maintain our community programs," the chief was saying. "Our anonymous benefactor has been generous, but we need to show results." Sullivan held back a snort. In his view, too much money was wasted on community relations when it could be spent on real police work. He thought about the black teenager who had come in earlier with what he considered a waste of time complaint. These community programs just encouraged people to bother the police with every little thing. Back in his office, James Johnson finally signed the check. He believed in doing good quietly, letting the results speak for themselves. His own father had taught him that real change happened when people did the right thing because it was right, not because they knew who was watching. He picked up his phone to call Marcus again, but stopped when his email notification popped up. It was from the school principal. "Mr. Johnson, I noticed Marcus left early today. I wanted to check if everything is all right, as this is very unusual for him." James frowned. Marcus leaving school early? That wasn't like him at all. He dialed his son's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Meanwhile, Captain Sullivan was reviewing the day's reports. He paused at a notification about the department's upcoming fundraising gala. All major donors would be there, including representatives from the mysterious Johnson Foundation that provided so much of their funding. Sullivan had never met anyone from the foundation. They'd always sent representatives to these events. The sun was setting when Marcus finally walked through their front door. James was waiting in the living room, worried after several unanswered calls. "Son," he said quietly, "want to tell me what's going on?" Marcus looked at his father, then at the floor. His shoulders slumped slightly. "I had to go to the police station today." James sat up straighter. "The police station? Are you okay? What happened?" Marcus sank into the armchair across from his father. "Someone's been following me and some other kids from school, taking pictures, sending threatening messages. I thought I should report it." "And?" James leaned forward, his check to the police foundation still in his briefcase upstairs. They didn't help, Dad. The captain there, Marcus's voice trailed off. "He basically said I was making it up, that I shouldn't be in that neighborhood anyway." James felt his chest tighten. "Did you get this officer's name?" "Captain Sullivan," Marcus said quietly, "but Dad, please don't make a big deal about it. I don't want any trouble." James looked at the ceiling, thinking about the $500,000 check in his briefcase. For 10 years, he had donated to the police department, believing he was helping build bridges between the police and the community. Now his own son had walked into that police station and experienced exactly what those donations were supposed to prevent. Neither father nor son knew it yet, but Captain Sullivan's dismissal of Marcus would set off a chain of events that would shake the entire department. The check upstairs, still unsigned, would become more than just money. It would become a tool for change. As Marcus headed upstairs to do his homework, James reached for his phone. It was time to make some calls. The anonymous benefactor was about to step into the light. The following week started like any other at Lincoln High School. Marcus sat in his advanced placement chemistry class, but his mind wasn't on the equations on the board. He kept thinking about Tyler, another black student who had received similar threatening messages. Tyler hadn't shown up to school today. During lunch break, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a text from Tyler. "They jumped me yesterday, near Wilson Street, same spot." Marcus's sandwich felt like lead in his stomach. He quickly walked to a quiet corner of the cafeteria and called Tyler. "Hey, you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice low. 2 broken ribs. Tyler's voice was barely a whisper. They had masks on. Took pictures while they did it. Said it was a message for all of us who don't belong in the neighborhood. Marcus closed his eyes, remembering Captain Sullivan's dismissive words. Stay in areas where you belong. He should have pushed harder, done more. At home that evening, James Johnson noticed his son pushing food around his plate instead of eating. Marcus had been quiet all week, jumping whenever his phone buzzed, checking over his shoulder on their driveway. Something's still bothering you, James said. It wasn't a question. Marcus put down his fork. Remember Tyler from the debate team? James nodded. He'd driven the boys to competition several times. He got attacked yesterday. Marcus's voice cracked. The same people who've been following us. The ones the police wouldn't help with. He pulled out his phone, showing his father the messages and pictures they'd received over the past weeks. James felt his hands tighten around his coffee cup. Why didn't you tell me how bad this was getting? I tried handling it the right way, Marcus said. I went to the police, but Captain Sullivan. He trailed off, then looked directly at his father. Dad, it's not just me and Tyler. Sarah from Student Council got messages too. We're all black students who live in Oak Hill. They're targeting us specifically. James stood up, walking to the window. From their house, he could see the police station's lights in the distance. The same station where his donations had funded new computers, training programs, and community outreach initiatives. I need you to tell me everything, James said. Every detail about what happened at the station. For the next hour, Marcus described his interaction with Captain Sullivan. The waiting while others were helped, the dismissive attitude, the subtle suggestions that Marcus didn't belong in the neighborhood. He didn't even look at the evidence. Marcus finished. Didn't take a report. Nothing. James pulled out his laptop. I'm going to show you something, he said, opening his emails. For 10 years, I've been funding half of that police department's community programs. Anonymously, through our foundation. Marcus stared at his father. What? I believed keeping it anonymous would make sure they did the right thing because it was right, not because they knew who was watching. James laughed bitterly. I was wrong. Just then, Marcus's phone buzzed again. His face went pale as he read the message. What is it? James asked. Marcus turned the phone around. There was a photo of Tyler in the hospital, followed by a message. Who's next? Maybe the debate team president? James called his lawyer immediately. John, I need everything you can find on Captain Richard Sullivan. Complaints, disciplinary records, everything. After hanging up, James looked at his son. No more handling this quietly. Tomorrow, we're going to that station together. Dad, no, Marcus protested. It'll only make things worse. It's already worse, James said firmly. Tyler's in the hospital. You're getting death threats. And somewhere in that station, there's a captain who thinks he can ignore crimes because of who the victims are. That night, neither Johnson slept well. Marcus lay awake, wondering if he'd done the right thing by finally telling his father everything. James sat in his study, reading through years of police department reports, seeing them in a completely new light. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for the police station, James received an email from his lawyer. Attached were 12 similar complaints against Captain Sullivan, all from minority residents, all quietly buried in internal affairs. James printed the complaints, put them in his briefcase next to the unsigned donation check, and called to Marcus. Let's go. Their quiet battle for justice was about to become very public. James Johnson sat in his lawyer's office, surrounded by stacks of papers. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desk as he read through another internal affairs complaint against Captain Sullivan. This was the 15th one he'd found, each more disturbing than the last. All these cases, James said, pointing to the files. How did they just disappear? John Martinez, his lawyer of 20 years, shook his head. Buried in paperwork. Marked as resolved without investigation. Look at the dates. He spread out several documents. Every time a formal complaint came in, Sullivan got a commendation or promotion within 3 months. James picked up a particular file from 2020. A young black woman had tried reporting stalkers in her neighborhood. Sullivan had dismissed her concerns. 2 weeks later, her car was vandalized. The case was never solved. Just like Marcus, James whispered, his hands trembling with anger. Same pattern. Same officer. Same result. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Tyler's coming home from hospital today. His parents are afraid to file a police report. James showed the message to John. 10 years. I've given them $500,000 every year for 10 years. Money that was supposed to make the department better, more responsive to the community. John pulled up the police department's financial records on his computer. Look at this, he said. Every program your foundation funded showed great results on paper. Community outreach numbers up. Response times improved. Citizen satisfaction increased. But the real complaints were hidden, James finished. They were showing me what I wanted to see. A knock on the door interrupted them. John's assistant entered with more files. Sir, we found something else. Captain Sullivan sits on the board that reviews citizen complaints. He's been there for 8 years. James stood up and walked to the window. From the 20th floor, he could see the whole city. Somewhere down there, his son was in school, probably still looking over his shoulder, while Tyler recovered from an attack that should have been prevented. John, he said quietly, how many other victims didn't report because they knew nothing would be done? Hard to say, John replied. But there's more. That fundraising gala next week? Sullivan's scheduled to receive an award for outstanding community relations. James turned around sharply. What? The department's using your money to give him an award for the very thing he's failing to do. James sat back down, pulling out his phone. He scrolled through old photos until he found one from last year's charity dinner. There was Sullivan in the background, smiling as another anonymous donation was announced. He doesn't know, James said slowly. None of them know that the money comes from a black family, that their biggest supporter has a son they turned away. John leaned forward. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time they found out. James pulled up his calendar. The gala's next Friday. Yes, all department heads will be there. City officials too. James started typing on his phone. Get me everything you can on Sullivan's record. Every complaint, every promotion, every commendation. I want to know who protected him and why. What about Marcus? John asked carefully. Going public could make things difficult for him. James paused, remembering his son's face when he described being dismissed at the police station. Marcus already lives with difficulty. He and every other kid who looks like him. They learn to be careful, to be quiet, to avoid certain places and people. They learn to live with fear. He stood up again, gathering the files. That ends now. My father taught me to be quiet, to work behind the scenes, to hope that money and good intentions would create change. But look where that got us. My son can't even walk home safely in his own neighborhood. John nodded, understanding. I'll have everything ready by Thursday, but James, he added, once you do this, there's no going back. The department won't take kindly to being exposed. Good, James replied, picking up his briefcase. Because I don't take kindly to my son being threatened while the police look the other way. It's time Captain Sullivan learned who really funds his department. As he walked out of the office, James's phone buzzed again. Another message from Marcus. Dad, got more pictures today. They're watching our house now. James clutched his phone tightly. The gala couldn't come soon enough. It was time to turn the tables and show Captain Sullivan what it felt like to be watched and judged. The Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished badges. Police officers in dress uniforms mingled with city officials in expensive suits. Captain Richard Sullivan stood near the podium, practicing his acceptance speech for the Outstanding Community Relations Award. At exactly 7:30 p.m., James Johnson walked in with Marcus by his side. They wore matching dark blue suits, their shoes clicking against the marble floor. Heads turned. The police department's mysterious benefactor never attended these events in person. Dad, Marcus whispered. Everyone's staring. Let them, James replied quietly. It's time they saw exactly who they've been dismissing. Chief Roberts rushed over, hand extended. Mr. Johnson, we weren't expecting. Your foundation usually sends a representative. I thought it was time for a change, James said, his voice carrying. My son Marcus convinced me. Captain Sullivan, hearing the conversation, walked over with a practiced smile. Marcus? Have we met? Yes, sir, Marcus said clearly. Last week, when I tried to report those threats. Sullivan's smile froze. His eyes darted between Marcus and James, making the connection. The color drained from his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chief Roberts said into the microphone, unaware of the tension. "Please welcome our biggest supporter, Mr. James Johnson of the Johnson Foundation." Applause filled the room. James walked to the podium, placing a thick folder on its surface. Marcus stood tall in the front row, watching his father. "Thank you," James began. "For 10 years, I've donated to this department anonymously. Today, I'm here to tell you why that's going to change." He opened the folder. "Last week, my son came to your station to report serious threats. Captain Sullivan," he looked directly at the officer, "would you like to tell everyone how you handled that?" Sullivan stepped forward, sweat visible on his forehead. "Mr. Johnson, perhaps we could discuss this privately." "No more privacy," James said firmly. "No more quiet burials of complaints. No more pretending." He held up a stack of papers. 15 complaints against Captain Sullivan in 8 years, all from minority citizens, all mysteriously disappeared. The room went silent. Chief Roberts reached for the microphone, but James held up his hand. "I'm not finished. 2 days ago, one of the students my son tried to warn you about was attacked. Tyler Washington, 17 years old. Honor student. 2 broken ribs." Camera flashes started popping. Someone from the local news was recording. "Every year," James continued, "I write a check for $500,000. Money that's supposed to help this department serve everyone equally." He pulled out this year's check from his jacket. "This year's donation comes with conditions." Sullivan stepped forward again. "Mr. Johnson, you don't understand the complexities." "I understand perfectly." James cut him off. "I understand that my son wasn't worthy of police protection in your eyes. I understand that Tyler wasn't either. I understand that for years, you've been burying complaints while accepting awards for community relations, paid for with my money." He turned to face the crowd. "My new conditions are simple: independent oversight of all complaints, body cameras on every officer, real community involvement, not just photo ops." Chief Roberts finally reached the podium. "Mr. Johnson, we appreciate your support, but you can't dictate department policy." "You're right," James agreed. "I can't, but I can take my funding elsewhere, and I can make sure every citizen knows exactly how their complaints have been handled." He held up Tyler's hospital photos. "This happened because Captain Sullivan wouldn't listen. How many others were hurt because they weren't worth his time?" Sullivan's face had turned red. "This is outrageous. You can't come in here and—" "I can and I will," James said calmly. "You see, Captain, you made a mistake. You thought you could judge people by how they look. You never imagined the black teenager you dismissed was the son of the man who pays for your new patrol cars." Marcus watched his father tear up the check. Pieces fell like snow across the podium. "The money stops until things change," James announced. "And they will change. Because next week, every complaint in this folder goes public. Every buried report. Every dismissed victim." He stepped back from the podium, putting his arm around Marcus's shoulders. "My son was brave enough to come to you for help. Now it's time to show him, and every other kid like him, that justice isn't just a word on your badges." As they walked out, leaving chaos behind them, Marcus whispered, "That was amazing, Dad." James smiled sadly. "No, son, that was just the beginning." The morning after the gala, Captain Sullivan sat alone in his office, watching his career crumble through his computer screen. Local news websites blazed with headlines. "Police Captain Exposed. Years of Buried Complaints." "Major Donor Confronts Police Bias." "Teen Attack Could Have Been Prevented." His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Reporters, angry citizens, even his own mother had called after seeing him on the morning news. He jumped as Chief Roberts burst through his door. "Administrative leave, effective immediately," the chief announced, dropping a letter on Sullivan's desk. "Internal Affairs wants to see every complaint you've handled in the past 8 years." Across town, Marcus walked into school feeling different. Students whispered as he passed, some offering supportive nods, others quick fist bumps. Tyler, back at school with bandaged ribs, met him at his locker. "Your dad's all over the internet," Tyler said quietly. "My parents are filing a new complaint today. They say this time someone will actually listen." Marcus nodded, then froze as his phone buzzed. The threatening messages had stopped after the gala, but he still tensed every time he got a text. This one, however, was different. 3 arrests made in connection with student attacks. Read the news alert. Anonymous tip led police to suspects. In his downtown office, James Johnson was also watching events unfold. John Martinez, his lawyer, spread out the morning papers across his desk. "The mayor wants to meet," John said. "City Council is calling for an emergency session. Even the FBI Civil Rights Division reached out." James looked at a photo of Captain Sullivan from the gala, his face frozen in shock as the truth came out. "What's the department saying officially?" "They're in damage control, promising a complete review of all complaints. New oversight committees, everything you asked for and more." The door opened and James's secretary rushed in. "Sir, there's a situation at the police station. Officers are gathering. They're saying they want to talk to you." James and John drove to the station, expecting protest or anger. Instead, they found 30 officers waiting outside, led by Sergeant Maria Rodriguez. "Mr. Johnson," she stepped forward. "We've been waiting for someone to expose this. Many of us tried reporting Sullivan's behavior internally, but nothing changed. We want to help make things right." Inside the station, the walls were already changing. The outstanding community relations plaques were gone, replaced by new posters announcing anonymous reporting hotlines and civil rights information. Chief Roberts met them in the conference room, looking tired but determined. "Mr. Johnson, we're implementing every reform you suggested, but we need your help to do it right." "My help?" James raised an eyebrow. "Yes, we want you to chair the new oversight committee. Real power, real change. And we want Marcus and his friends involved in our youth outreach program redesign." James thought about his son's courage in coming forward, about Tyler's injuries, about all the complaints that have been silenced over the years. "On one condition," he said. "Captain Sullivan doesn't just get suspended. He faces real consequences." "Already done," the chief replied. "He's been referred for criminal negligence charges related to Tyler's case. The DA's office is reviewing everything." That evening, the Johnsons' doorbell rang. On their steps stood Officer Sarah Chen, one of the younger cops from the station. "I was there when Marcus tried to report the threats," she said, looking ashamed. "I should have spoken up. But now," she handed them a thick folder. "This is everything I documented about Sullivan's cases over the past 2 years. I kept copies, waiting for a chance to expose it." More changes came rapidly. By week's end, Sullivan had resigned rather than face an internal investigation. 3 more officers followed, their own misconduct exposed in the wave of revelations. Marcus sat with his father in their living room, watching the news coverage. "Did you ever think this would happen when you made that first donation 10 years ago?" James shook his head. "I thought money alone could fix things. I was wrong. Real change needs brave people willing to speak up." He looked at his son proudly. "Like you." Marcus's phone buzzed again, another news alert. This time, he didn't flinch. The threatening messages had stopped completely since the arrests, replaced by updates about police reform and community meetings. "They're calling it the Johnson Protocol," Marcus read aloud. "New guidelines for handling complaints, mandatory bias training, community oversight. Dad, you did it." James put his hand on his son's shoulder. "No, Marcus, we did it." Sometimes it takes a father's resources and a son's courage to make real change happen. 3 months after the gala confrontation, Marcus stood at the front of Lincoln High's auditorium, addressing a packed room of students, parents, and police officers. The newly formed Student Police Alliance had drawn more attention than anyone expected. "When I first reported those threats," Marcus said into the microphone, "I was told I didn't belong in my own neighborhood. Today, we're making sure no student ever hears those words again." In the back of the room, Richard Sullivan, no longer Captain Sullivan, sat quietly. He looked different now, older, humbler, wearing civilian clothes instead of his uniform. The past months had changed him in ways he never expected. After his resignation, Sullivan had hit rock bottom. His pension was gone, his reputation ruined. Then came the letter from Tyler Washington's parents, inviting him to visit Tyler in physical therapy. Watching the teenager struggle to recover from an attack he could have prevented broke something inside Sullivan. Next speaker, Marcus announced, is someone who asked to address us today. Mr. Sullivan? A murmur ran through the crowd as Sullivan walked to the podium. Some people stood to leave, but James Johnson, sitting in the front row, raised his hand for patience. I'd spent 20 years behind a badge, Sullivan began, his voice shaking, thinking I was serving justice. But I wasn't serving justice, I was serving my own prejudices. He pulled out a piece of paper, then put it back in his pocket. I wrote a speech, but that's not what this needs. What this needs is the truth. Sullivan looked directly at Marcus. I failed you. I failed Tyler. I failed every person who came to me for help and got turned away because of what they looked like or where they lived. The room was completely silent now. Since losing my badge, I've spent every Tuesday and Thursday helping at Tyler's physical therapy sessions. Every Wednesday, I attend bias recognition training. And every Monday, I meet with families whose complaints I dismissed, listening to their stories. He paused, taking a deep breath. I can't undo the harm I caused, but I can help make sure it never happens again. From his seat, James Johnson watched the man who had dismissed his son now fighting back tears at a podium. The transformation seemed almost unbelievable, but James had seen it happening gradually over the past months. Sullivan had shown up at their door 6 weeks ago, asking to join the police reform committee as a civilian advisor. I know how the system hides its problems, he had said. Let me help fix what I helped break. Now, Sullivan was turning to the new police chief in the audience. The problems don't end with one captain or one department. They're buried in the system, in our training, in our assumptions. But thanks to Marcus Johnson's courage and his father's dedication, we're finally facing them. After the assembly, students gathered around a table where Officer Sarah Chen was demonstrating the department's new reporting app. Every complaint is logged instantly, she explained. No more buried reports. No more missing files. Marcus watched as Tyler, still moving carefully with healing ribs, approached Sullivan. Sir, Tyler said, my parents wanted you to know they appreciate what you've been doing at the rehab center. Sullivan nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Your parents' forgiveness. I don't deserve it. Maybe not, Tyler replied. But this isn't about deserving. It's about changing. Later that evening, James and Marcus sat in their living room, reviewing the day's events. The local news was showing clips from the assembly. Did you ever think, Marcus asked, that Sullivan would change like this? James considered the question. People can surprise you. Sometimes they just need to face their mistakes honestly. Marcus picked up his phone, opening the new police app. The threat reporting feature had his name on it. The Marcus Johnson Protocol, because every voice matters. The old Sullivan would have hated this, Marcus said, showing his father the screen. The old Sullivan isn't here anymore, James replied. Sometimes the biggest change starts with the most unlikely person. Outside their window, a police car rolled slowly past, part of the new community patrol program. The officer inside waved, and Marcus waved back without hesitation. The fear was gone, replaced by something new. Hope. Not just for himself, but for his community, for Tyler, and yes, even for a former police captain learning to see the world through new eyes. 1 year to the day after Marcus first walked into the police station, the city council chamber was packed for a special ceremony. Banners reading Community First, 1 year of change, hung from the walls. On stage, 3 empty chairs waited for the day's speakers. Marcus adjusted his tie, reviewing his notes one last time. At 18 now, he looked more confident, taller somehow. The frightened teenager who once stood before Captain Sullivan was gone, replaced by a young leader who had helped reshape his community. Ready? James asked his son, straightening his own tie. Both wore matching blue suits, just like they had at the gala a year ago. The third speaker joined them backstage, Richard Sullivan, former police captain, now director of the new Civil Rights Training Institute. The past year had aged him, but his eyes showed a different kind of strength. Mayor Chen approached the podium. 1 year ago, our community faced a crisis. Today, we celebrate how that crisis became an opportunity for real change. The audience included faces from every part of their journey. Tyler Washington, fully recovered and headed to college on a full scholarship. Officer Sarah Chen, recently promoted to lead the new Community Response Division. Even Sullivan's old partner, who had finally spoken up about years of witness discrimination. Our first speaker, the mayor announced, Mr. James Johnson, whose courage in confronting injustice sparked a revolution in police-community relations. James walked to the podium, placing his notes aside. A year ago, I thought money could solve problems quietly. My son taught me that real change requires bold truth and brave voices. He outlined the year's achievements. Complaints down by 60%, response times improved in all neighborhoods, community trust at record highs. The Johnson Protocol had been adopted by 12 other cities. But numbers don't tell the whole story, James continued. The real change is in the daily lives of our citizens, in students who walk home without fear, in officers who serve with true understanding, in a community that finally trusts its protectors. Marcus spoke next, his voice steady and strong. Last year, I was a victim. Today, I stand here as a partner in change. He gestured to the audience where several teenagers sat wearing Student Safety Ambassador badges, part of the new Youth Police Cooperation program he had helped design. We didn't just change policies, Marcus said. We changed hearts. We showed that justice isn't about power or position. It's about people caring for people. Then came Sullivan's turn. The room grew quiet as he approached the podium. Many still remembered him as the symbol of what had been wrong, but his transformation had become part of the community's healing. A year ago, I was the problem, Sullivan began. I wore a badge but didn't honor it. I had power but misused it. Thanks to Marcus Johnson's courage and his father's wisdom, I learned that true strength lies in admitting mistakes and working to fix them. He turned to face the Johnsons. These men could have destroyed me. Instead, they showed me how to rebuild myself by helping rebuild our community. After the ceremony, people gathered in the courtyard. Tyler, wearing his college acceptance letter as a badge of honor, stood with Marcus near the new community bulletin board. Remember how scared we were last year? Tyler asked. Marcus nodded, watching Officer Chen demonstrate the reporting app to a group of parents. Now look at us, leading instead of hiding. James joined them, followed by Sullivan. The four men, once divided by fear and prejudice, now stood together as partners in progress. The Johnson Foundation's annual police department donation came due today, James announced. Are you still making it anonymous? Marcus asked with a smile. James laughed. No more anonymity. Change happens in the light. Sullivan cleared his throat. Chief Roberts asked me to tell you, they're renaming the training center. The Johnson Washington Center for Community Policing. Tyler's eyes widened. Washington? As in? Your family, Sullivan confirmed, because your forgiveness taught us all something about healing. As the sun set over the city, Marcus looked around the courtyard. Students chatted easily with officers. Parents shared concerns without fear. Community leaders planned future initiatives. Dad, he said quietly, remember when you said sometimes it takes a father's resources and a son's courage to make real change? James nodded. I think it takes a whole community willing to change together. They watched as Sullivan joined a group of new recruits, sharing his story as a lesson in humility and growth. The former captain who once dismissed a frightened teen was now teaching others to listen, to care, to serve with genuine respect. The city had changed. They had all changed. And somewhere, another young person would find the courage to speak up, knowing their voice would finally be heard.